Hi everyone. Welcome back to the channel. This is Black Queen Dominion, where we dive into stories of power, resilience, and the sweet taste of revenge. If you're new here, don't forget to like and subscribe because you won't want to miss what's coming. Today's story is about a woman who was underestimated, overlooked, and treated like she was invisible, only to rise and claim a crown they never saw coming. Sit tight because this is a story of quiet strength, strategic brilliance, and a holiday they'll never forget. The holiday season had always been a battlefield in the Richardson household. For as long as anyone could remember, my mother-in-law, a woman who draped herself in holiday cheer-like armor, had made it clear that I was help in the grand theater of Christmas. She never said it directly, but every glance, every comment, every chore she assigned carried the same unspoken message. I was just the black woman in her family's world, someone who cleaned, cooked, polished, and served. The dining table, the living room, the sparkling tree in the corner, all meticulously arranged by my hands, while her smile took credit for the glow. Christmas Eve arrived, and with it the familiar sting of invisibility. I walked into their house carrying a sense of calm purpose, knowing that today's tasks were just another chapter in a story they thought they were writing. The smells of cinnamon and baked ham filled the air, lights twinkled with an almost mocking perfection, and the laughter of my husband's family echoed around me. I smiled politely, keeping my own counsel as I arranged ornaments, polished silverware, and folded napkins with the precision of someone who had learned to operate in the shadows. But beneath the practiced motions, my mind was elsewhere. Weeks before, I had been working quietly, making discreet phone calls, reviewing documents, signing papers in the presence of lawyers who knew better than to underestimate me. There was a secret that no one suspected, a truth I was cultivating while they laughed and assigned me menial tasks. I had purchased the house. Yes, the very mansion where I was made to scrub floors and polish brass. Every transaction was legal, every document official. My name on the deed, my signature binding and final, but hidden from their eyes until the perfect moment. The day began normally enough. I hummed along with holiday songs that played faintly in the background, setting tables, arranging glasses, and carrying platters. My mother-in-law, a woman who had always prided herself on control, glanced at me with that familiar look, the one that assumed I could never rise beyond her expectations. She handed me a stack of cleaning supplies with a saccharine smile, her words dripping with condescension. "Just in case you feel like tidying up a little more," she said. It was a gift, wrapped in bright paper and adorned with ribbons, the perfect symbol of how they saw me, useful, subservient, and beneath notice. I took the package with a calm nod, letting her assumption roll off me. I could see my husband's discomfort. He sensed something, though he didn't know what, as I carried the supplies into the kitchen. In that moment, the festive decor, the warm lights, the laughter, all seemed to sharpen into a contrast against the truth I held. They believed this was their domain, their display of wealth, their Christmas perfection. Little did they know, everything they had was now quietly, irrevocably mine. I spent the morning moving through the house with deliberate composure. I set out more plates, I arranged cutlery, I straightened pillows and fluffed cushions, all while keeping my secret shielded behind a neutral smile. My mother-in-law continued her parade of small, pointed gestures, unaware that each insult, each glance, was merely adding fuel to the fire of her own downfall. To her, I was invisible. To me, she was unwittingly constructing the stage for my ultimate reveal. Then came the moment of anticipation. The tree stood tall, presents gathered beneath it, wrapped in paper that promised joy, not knowing it was about to conceal shock. I lingered near the tree, letting the chatter of the family wash over me, counting down the minutes until the unveiling of my secret. My hands, which had cleaned and polished this very home, were the same hands that had secured ownership without a single clue being given away. I had done everything they expected, everything they commanded, and all along I was preparing for the ultimate revelation. When the time came to exchange gifts, my mother-in-law handed me a small box with a bright ribbon, smiling with the assumption that her gesture was generous and benign. I thanked her politely, setting it aside without opening it, my attention focused elsewhere. There were subtle glances, whispers of excitement, the kind that only people who truly think they are in control can enjoy. I let them have their moment, because the satisfaction of watching them descend into disbelief would be far greater when the right time came. I excused myself briefly, slipping into the study where I had left the documents. The proof of purchase, the binding legal papers that confirmed my ownership. I had arranged everything meticulously. The deed, notarized signatures, official documentation, all in a neat stack, ready to be revealed at the precise moment. It was not enough to simply own the house. The revelation needed to be performed like a performance, a symphony of justice, elegance, and undeniable authority. Returning to the living room, I carried the documents lightly in my hands, concealed beneath the tablecloth as if they were nothing more than papers. My mother-in-law was chatting with guests, gesturing proudly as if she were the orchestrator of the entire event. She had no idea that her every boast, every laugh, every smug glance was about to crumble under the weight of reality. My husband noticed my posture, the subtle tension in my shoulders, and the slight curve of a smile that he did not recognize. He had no idea, but he trusted me, and that trust would be rewarded by the truth that he too was about to witness. The family gathered for photos, drinks were poured, and laughter filled the corners of the room. I waited, patient, letting the anticipation build. My mother-in-law kept glancing at me, her eyes occasionally narrowing in a vague suspicion, but she could not see the storm beneath my calm exterior. The irony was exquisite. The woman who had handed me cleaning supplies, who had believed she could control my role in her life, was about to realize that she had no power over the very walls she inhabited. And just like that, the moment arrived. I stood and asked everyone to gather around the tree, asking for just a minute of attention. The room's chatter dimmed, eyes turning toward me, curiosity piqued. I reached beneath the tablecloth, pulling out the neatly stacked documents, letting them rest visibly on the polished coffee table. The edges of the papers gleamed under the Christmas lights, official seals catching reflections in a way that demanded notice. I let a pause linger, letting the realization settle before I spoke. This was not a shout, it was not a demand. It was the quiet, undeniable presence of authority. The documents spoke for themselves, and in their silence the truth began to ripple through the room. The air shifted. My mother-in-law's smile faltered just slightly at first, then more noticeably as her eyes scanned the papers. Confusion flickered, quickly replaced by disbelief. She reached out, trembling, as if touching the documents might somehow alter reality. But reality was solid, permanent, undeniable. I had bought her house. Every corner she had polished, every ornament she had boasted about, every proud holiday display now belonged to me. The woman she had treated as a servant had quietly become the owner of it all. And in that moment, I felt a surge of vindication, tempered by elegance and control. I did not gloat. I did not rush to claim victory with words. I let the revelation settle like a storm breaking over calm water. Their assumptions had been shattered. Their laughter stilled. Their sense of control evaporated. And all the while I stood there, a queen in the room she had never imagined could be mine. This was just the beginning. The shock, the whispers, the disbelief. They were only the first ripple of a wave that would carry through every corner of the Richardson household. They had underestimated me, mistreated me, and assumed I would remain silent. But now they had a new reality to confront. And this Christmas the gift I gave was far more than any present wrapped in paper. It was power. It was ownership. It was the undeniable truth that the woman they tried to keep beneath them could rise and claim what was hers with grace and strategy. The room was silent, but the silence was heavy, the kind of silence that screams when words fail. I watched my mother-in-law's face, a canvas of disbelief, confusion, and slowly dawning horror. Her hands hovered above the papers as if she could somehow snatch back the reality she had taken for granted. But there was nothing to undo, no magic trick, no argument, no charm. Every signature, every seal, every line of legal text was immovable. It was the truth laid bare, and she was forced to confront it. Guests leaned in, murmuring among themselves. My husband's eyes were wide, a mixture of pride and astonishment flickering in them. He realized, as everyone else did, that this wasn't just a Christmas surprise. It was a revelation, a seismic shift in the household hierarchy. For years my mother-in-law had curated the narrative. The perfect family, the perfect home, the perfect holiday season, all while subtly belittling me. Every insult, every snide remark, every chore forced upon me had been absorbed silently, stored like fuel for this exact moment. And now, the quiet woman who cleaned, cooked, and smiled through the condescension was the owner of it all. I let the room adjust, letting the shock settle, letting their egos stumble on the invisible edges of reality. My mother-in-law finally found her voice, a shaky, incredulous sound that tried to disguise panic with disbelief. Her eyes darted between me and the documents, searching for a loophole, a trick, a mistake. There was none. I had done my homework, dotted every I, crossed every T, ensured that every legal box was checked. I was untouchable and she knew it instinctively. The knowledge of her helplessness burned in her eyes. The rest of the family began to murmur, realizing that their assumptions had been built on sand. They had thought I was invisible, expendable, someone who could be managed and dismissed. Now the very house they had laughed in, the very Christmas they had celebrated as their domain was mine. Every decorative wreath, every polished ornament, every festive light belonged to me by law and by strategy. And the most exquisite part? I hadn't even needed to raise my voice. My power was in the quiet certainty, in the preparation, in the elegance of execution. As the reality sank in, I observed the subtle shifts in body language. My mother-in-law's shoulders slumped slightly, a physical surrender to what she could not fight. The housekeeper she had once been, the servant she assumed I would always be, had transformed into the owner, the queen, the one whose decisions now held weight. Her smile had vanished, replaced by a flush of humiliation. She had never expected a Christmas present to be a lesson in power, and she certainly had not anticipated that the lesson would come from the woman she had tried to belittle year after year. I moved deliberately, placing a hand lightly on the documents, emphasizing their authority. They were more than papers. They were symbols of strategy, patience, and quiet genius. I had waited, calculated, and planned, turning every insult, every assumption, every glance into the architecture of my revenge. The family could stare, argue, or plead. The truth remained immovable. I had transformed what they considered my weakness into my weapon. My husband stepped closer, his presence both protective and awed. He whispered something to me, a simple acknowledgement that the work I had done in secret had changed the course of their family dynamic forever. He had seen the effort, the intelligence, the patience it took to orchestrate this moment, and he finally understood why I had endured the subtle cruelty, why I had tolerated their assumptions, and why I had never spoken until the moment was perfect. It was not just revenge. It was justice delivered with grace and precision. As the family processed the revelation, I began a slow walk through the house, letting my presence assert itself. Every room, every corner, every meticulously maintained space was now mine to command. The living room, where I had polished floors under their watchful eyes, now echoed with a new authority. The kitchen, where I had prepared countless meals while being dismissed as mere help, now belonged to the woman who had quietly claimed her stake. And the Christmas tree, standing proud and twinkling under the dimmed lights, held the documents that had shifted power irreversibly. I noticed the subtle panic in my mother-in-law's movements. She touched the furniture lightly as if it might not obey her anymore. She glanced at the walls, the photographs, the decorations, all now under my dominion, all proof that the queen she had underestimated had risen. Her carefully curated sense of superiority, her aura of control, was now fractured, replaced with a desperate calculation to salvage dignity. But dignity, like control, is not something that can be reclaimed once the truth has been revealed. The guests, once amused by what they thought was a humorous family dynamic, now whispered among themselves, eyes wide, curiosity tinged with awe. Social norms and assumptions had been overturned in a matter of minutes. I could feel the room's energy shift, awe replacing mockery, respect replacing assumptions. They had all learned a lesson in humility, and it was delivered not with shouting or confrontation, but with quiet strategy and undeniable evidence. I guided the attention subtly toward my mother-in-law, who now stood in stunned silence, grasping the reality of her situation. She had prided herself on controlling every detail of her household, from the placement of the silverware to the arrangement of the Christmas tree. Yet here she was, powerless, as the woman she had tried to suppress held the ultimate authority. The irony was exquisite. She had spent years polishing and cleaning the house, unaware that her actions had contributed to the empire she believed she controlled, but which now legally belonged to me. Even my husband, usually reserved and polite, felt the weight of the moment. He saw how deftly I had turned every insult into advantage, every chore into preparation, every slight into leverage. His admiration was quiet but deep, a reflection of his recognition that I had not only claimed property but had rewritten the family hierarchy with elegance and strategy. The satisfaction of victory was enhanced by its subtlety. No one could accuse me of aggression, only brilliance. As I looked around, I realized that this was more than a personal victory. It was a statement, a lesson in power, patience, and precision. I had transformed a lifetime of underestimation into undeniable authority. The documents on the table were more than legal proof. They were a testament to the strength of a Black woman who had been treated as invisible, underestimated, and undervalued. I had taken control of the narrative, the space, and the family's perception in one elegant move. The rest of the evening unfolded in a strange, almost surreal fashion. Conversations continued, but they were different now, tinged with caution and newfound respect. The holiday music played, but it carried a new meaning, a soundtrack for triumph rather than subservience. I moved through the house with deliberate calm, a queen walking through her kingdom, fully aware of the power I held. The room that had once been a theater of belittlement was now a stage for my authority. Even as the family attempted to navigate the awkward reality, I remained composed. I allowed them to adjust, to absorb, to recognize that control had shifted. My mother-in-law tried to reclaim some semblance of influence, offering polite smiles and small gestures, but it was hollow, ineffective. She had been bested not by anger or confrontation, but by strategic patience, intelligence, and the quiet accumulation of power. And as the night progressed, I realized that the victory was complete. The house, the holiday, the family dynamic, all had been transformed. I had turned every insult, every chore, every slight into a stepping stone toward my triumph. The documents were more than proof. They were a symbol of resilience, strategy, and the undeniable authority of a woman who refused to remain in the shadows. This Christmas they had learned a lesson they would never forget. Underestimate a Black woman, dismiss her, belittle her, and she might quietly become the force that changes everything. The power had shifted, the crown was claimed, and the queen had risen. The morning after Christmas arrived quietly, but the Richardson household was anything but calm. The holiday had ended, the dishes had been cleared, and the house, now under my ownership, carried a weight that no one could ignore. The previous evening's revelation had left everyone reeling. My mother-in-law's carefully constructed world had cracked, and the cracks were widening with every passing moment. Her pride, once untouchable, was now fractured. Her sense of authority had evaporated. And the rest of the family? They moved through the house with cautious, measured steps, unsure how to act in a space that no longer belonged to them. I began the day with the same quiet confidence I had displayed during the gift reveal. There was no rush, no desperate need to assert dominance verbally. The documents had already done the work. But the reactions around me were telling. My mother-in-law, once the orchestrator of every holiday, now fumbled with routine decisions. She questioned herself subtly, asking for permission or reassurance where none was required. It was a delicate dance of shame, frustration, and reluctant recognition of the shift in power. Every glance she cast my way was loaded with a silent acknowledgement. I had won. The rest of the family followed her lead. My husband's siblings whispered quietly, their eyes flicking toward me with a mix of awe and confusion. They had witnessed the shift but were uncertain how to navigate it. I could sense the hesitation, the mental recalibration as they tried to understand that the woman they had long dismissed as background noise was now the central authority. Every step I took through the house reinforced the message. The space they had treated as theirs was no longer a stage for their pride. It was a kingdom I now commanded. Breakfast unfolded with a strange, almost surreal tension. Plates clinked, coffee brewed, and holiday leftovers sat untouched on the table as conversations skirted around the elephant in the room. My mother-in-law's attempts at casual talk were awkward, strained. She kept glancing at the legal documents I had left on the counter as if their presence alone could erase the reality she faced. Every subtle movement, every hesitant comment, reinforced her diminishing control. She realized, perhaps too late, that control is never given. It is claimed, and I had claimed it quietly, strategically, irrevocably. I moved through the morning with deliberate grace. I cleaned only where I chose, not out of obligation but as a demonstration of authority. Where once I had scrubbed and polished on demand, I now did so selectively with intention. Every task I performed was a reminder that I was no longer a servant. I was a queen in her own home. The family's reactions were priceless. astonishment, disbelief, and a hesitant respect that none of them had expected. They had assumed that dominance came from volume and command, but I had proven that true power is subtle, strategic, and absolute. By mid-morning, the ripple effects began to manifest more tangibly. My mother-in-law attempted to assert herself in small ways, rearranging a chair, moving a decorative item, suggesting a minor change, only to realize that such gestures carried no weight without my approval. Her confidence faltered with each subtle defiance that I chose to ignore or redirect. I watched her struggle internally, knowing that she had underestimated the patience, intelligence, and foresight required to orchestrate a coup so elegantly. She had spent years teaching me her rules, unaware that I was absorbing, calculating, and planning my own rise. Meanwhile, my husband's expression shifted from astonishment to admiration. He had long known my capabilities, but witnessing the quiet execution of strategy in action left him impressed and proud. He saw the patience it had taken to bide my time, the intelligence it had required to secure the house without alerting anyone, and the finesse with which I revealed the truth. This was not a simple act of revenge. It was a masterclass in control, patience, and elegance. His support was unwavering, a silent acknowledgement that our partnership now extended to shared dominance within the household. The afternoon brought new visitors, extended family and friends who had come to continue the holiday celebrations. The atmosphere shifted immediately upon their arrival. Conversations paused, eyes flicked toward me, and the subtle power dynamics established the night before became palpable. My mother-in-law attempted to maintain normalcy, but her attempts were hollow. Everyone sensed the shift in authority. Where once I had moved quietly in the background, now I was the focal point, the center of the room's energy. Even casual glances acknowledged the undeniable fact. The woman they had overlooked and underestimated now held the ultimate control. I allowed the visitors to explore the house, subtly guiding their attention toward the details that underscored my ownership. Family photographs now included images I had introduced, subtle design choices reflected my taste, and minor adjustments reinforced that the space belonged to me. Each action was deliberate, a quiet assertion of authority that required no confrontation. My mother-in-law's unease grew with every step, every casual remark, every acknowledgement from visitors that the home's ambience had shifted subtly but decisively. By evening, the full weight of reality had settled in for my mother-in-law. She wandered from room to room, checking the kitchen, the living room, the holiday decorations, each space a reminder that control had changed hands. Her pride, carefully maintained over decades, had been eroded by the quiet, strategic execution of a plan she never saw coming. Every assumption she had made about me, every insult she had delivered, had been absorbed and repurposed to construct the ultimate victory. The woman she believed she had controlled had become untouchable. As night fell, the family gathered once more in the living room. The Christmas tree twinkled in quiet elegance, now accompanied by the unspoken acknowledgement of power. My mother-in-law sat silently, her previous energy of control replaced by quiet calculation, as if she were trying to determine what steps remained to regain some semblance of authority. The documents that had initiated the shift were placed subtly on the table, visible but unobtrusive, a permanent reminder of the Queen's quiet triumph. In that moment, I realized that the shift in dynamics was more than symbolic. The house itself, the family, the traditions, all had been recalibrated. I had turned every slight, every insult, every expectation into leverage. I had transformed years of underestimation into undeniable authority. And as I surveyed the room, I understood that the real power of this victory was not in the documents alone but in the ripple effects that would continue to unfold long after the holiday season ended. My mother-in-law's attempts at regaining influence were subtle but persistent. She adjusted her tone, softened her approach, and even tried to charm me with small gestures. But authority once shifted cannot be easily reclaimed. I responded with measured acknowledgement, maintaining control without confrontation. Each interaction reinforced the new hierarchy, quietly teaching the family that the rules had changed. The woman they had treated as subordinate was now the arbiter of their environment, their interactions, and their understanding of power. By the end of the evening, a new rhythm had settled into the household. The tension remained, but it was tempered by respect, reluctant perhaps but undeniable. My mother-in-law, once the center of control, now navigated her diminished authority with caution, a subtle deference in every gesture. The family had learned, in the quietest yet most profound way, that underestimating the woman they had marginalized could result in irreversible consequences. As I prepared to leave the living room for the night, I glanced at the documents, the holiday decorations, and the subtle changes in the atmosphere. Victory was not loud or boisterous. It was quiet, deliberate, and undeniable. I had transformed my subservience into strategy, my patience into power, and my invisibility into authority. The ripple from my Christmas revelation had become a tidal wave, reshaping the Richardson household in ways they would never forget. The days following Christmas were unlike any in the Richardson household. The revelation that I now owned the house had settled like a slow, unyielding tide, reshaping the family's interactions, their confidence, and their assumptions about hierarchy. My mother-in-law, once untouchable in her meticulously curated domain, now moved with hesitation. Every gesture, every smile, every suggestion was calculated against the quiet authority I embodied. The house, once a stage for her pride, had become a mirror reflecting her diminished control. And I moved through it with a calm precision, allowing the effects of my victory to unfold without interference. I started each morning deliberately, performing my routines not as obligation, but as a demonstration of power. Breakfast was no longer a frantic scramble to meet the expectations of others. It was an orchestrated display of the order I now commanded. I decided what was prepared, where it was served, and how the space was arranged. Each decision was subtle, yet it carried the unmistakable weight of authority. My mother-in-law lingered nearby, observing with the unease of someone aware that their influence had been nullified. The irony was exquisite. She had spent decades training me in household management, assuming she was imparting control, when in reality she had been teaching me to inherit her empire. The family's reactions were equally telling. My husband's siblings began to test the new dynamic in small ways, offering opinions, making suggestions, and attempting to assert influence in areas they had once considered trivial. I met each effort with calm acknowledgement, subtly redirecting or reasserting control. The result was fascinating. They began to realize that the rules had changed. The woman they had long underestimated was no longer constrained by expectations or assumptions. Every attempt to reclaim dominance was met with quiet strategy, demonstrating that power could be exercised without aggression, only with precision. The mother-in-law's attempts at social manipulation intensified. She tried to orchestrate minor events, calling friends and relatives, attempting to host gatherings and assert relevance. But every plan she initiated now required my approval, and the subtle recalibration of influence became clear to all who visited. Invitations were sent with my oversight, decorations were arranged according to my direction, and even the smallest details, the placement of a centerpiece, the alignment of silverware, the order of serving, bore my invisible signature. The family began to murmur among themselves, noting the shift in authority with a mixture of awe and unease. One afternoon, while I moved through the living room, I noticed a subtle change in the way my mother-in-law treated me. She no longer issued commands or expectations. Instead, her interactions carried the hesitance of someone unsure how to assert relevance. The tension in her posture, the slight tremor in her gestures, and the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes revealed the depth of her awareness. She had been unseated, and there was nothing she could do to reclaim the throne. It was an exquisite moment, a quiet validation of the months of preparation, patience, and strategic planning that had culminated in my triumph. Visitors during this period reinforced the shift in dynamics. Friends and extended family noticed the subtle transformation immediately. Conversations were punctuated by glances at me, acknowledgments of the changes I had implemented, and a quiet deference that had not existed before. I allowed them to observe, guiding interactions subtly while letting my mother-in-law's diminished authority be apparent without confrontation. The elegance of this strategy lay in its simplicity. By exercising influence quietly and consistently, the Queen's presence became undeniable. My husband's support remained unwavering, a quiet anchor in the shifting tides. He observed the changes with admiration, recognizing the patience, intelligence, and strategy that had gone into orchestrating this victory. Together, we navigated the delicate dynamics of family hierarchy, subtly reinforcing the new order without overt conflict. The elegance of this approach ensured that the Queen's dominance was unassailable, respected even when unspoken and evident to all who entered the household. The mother-in-law's frustration began to manifest in unexpected ways. She attempted to rally allies within the family, whispering, reminding, or pointing out past deeds in an effort to reclaim influence. Yet each attempt only highlighted her diminished position. When she suggested a change, her voice carried less authority than mine. When she corrected an arrangement, her words were met with polite acknowledgement, but the final decision rested with me. Even her closest supporters began to shift allegiance, recognizing that power now resided in a new and undeniable source. By midweek, the household had settled into a rhythm that reflected the new hierarchy. I allowed my presence to be felt not through confrontation, but through subtle orchestration. The placement of furniture, the arrangement of decor, the timing of meals, and even the flow of conversation. Every detail was a demonstration of control, a reminder that the Queen's authority was absolute and strategically exercised. The family adapted, slowly learning that the space they once commanded was no longer theirs to dominate. The social consequences extended beyond the walls of the house. Friends who visited for tea, neighbors who stopped by with holiday greetings, and even distant relatives who had heard of the Christmas revelation began to treat me with an unmistakable respect. The quiet acknowledgement of authority, the understanding that I had orchestrated a flawless coup, created ripples in the social fabric of the household. I became the focal point, the arbiter of influence, the unseen strategist whose authority extended beyond mere ownership into respect and subtle fear. By the end of the week, the mother-in-law's attempts at reconciliation had shifted into cautious acceptance. She no longer sought to assert control but instead moved carefully within the boundaries I had established. Her pride remained, but it was tempered by a growing awareness that the Queen's power could not be challenged. The family had learned the subtle lesson of strategy, patience, and intelligence. True authority does not require shouting, it requires planning, precision, and the patience to act at the right moment. As I moved through the house one evening, observing the subdued tension and subtle adjustments in behavior, I reflected on the quiet power of strategy. The victory was complete not because of confrontation or aggression, but because I had transformed years of underestimation into a tool for authority. Every insult, every slight, every expectation of obedience had been turned into a stepping stone toward dominance. The ripple of Christmas had become a tidal wave, reshaping the household and redefining relationships. And yet I knew that the final stage was approaching. The subtle shifts in behavior, the realignment of alliances, and the quiet acknowledgement of my power were only the beginning. The mother-in-law, resilient and prideful, would eventually test the boundaries, perhaps even attempt to reclaim some sense of control. But I was prepared. The documents were permanent, the authority undeniable, and my strategy had already set the foundation for every eventuality. This was no longer merely about ownership. It was about respect, acknowledgement, and the establishment of an unshakable hierarchy. The Queen had risen, the crown had been claimed, and the household would never be the same. Every interaction, every gesture, every subtle movement now carried the weight of authority, and the family had no choice but to adjust. I had turned a moment of insult into a lifetime of power, demonstrating that patience, strategy, and intelligence are the ultimate weapons. The weeks following Christmas had transformed the Richardson household into a place of quiet recalibration. The air, once filled with casual superiority, subtle condescension, and invisible hierarchies, now carried the unmistakable weight of acknowledged authority. I moved through the rooms with the confidence of a queen in her domain, every step, every gesture, every glance asserting a dominance that needed no words. My mother-in-law, once the orchestrator of every moment, now navigated her diminished influence with cautious awareness, understanding that the rules had irrevocably changed. The culmination of this transformation began subtly, in everyday interactions that highlighted the shift in power. Breakfasts were no longer about speed or compliance. They were orchestrated by my direction. Decisions about decor, event planning, and even casual conversations were subtly guided by me, and the family adapted. My mother-in-law attempted minor interventions, suggesting changes, offering corrections, or giving advice, but every attempt was met with quiet acknowledgement rather than acquiescence. The authority I wielded was now unquestioned because it had been exercised strategically, consistently, and gracefully. It was during a midweek gathering that the full consequences of my rise became visible. Relatives who had visited sporadically now watched the interactions with keen observation. They noticed the subtle recalibration of household hierarchy, the mother-in-law's subdued gestures, the family's tentative deference, and my calm, unwavering presence. The shift in energy was palpable, the tension between pride and acceptance creating an almost electric undercurrent. For some, admiration mingled with disbelief. For others, a quiet awe settled in, acknowledging that the woman they had overlooked was now the undeniable center of authority. I moved through the room deliberately, managing interactions and decisions with an elegant precision. A simple question about seating arrangements became a demonstration of influence. My choice was accepted without challenge, establishing the subtle but undeniable message that authority had changed hands. My mother-in-law's lips pressed into a thin line. She attempted to interject, but even her closest allies instinctively deferred to my judgment. The lesson had been absorbed, not loudly, not confrontationally, but silently, as power often operates. The household began to reflect the consequences in tangible ways. Family traditions that had been dictated by my mother-in-law were subtly shifted to incorporate my preferences. Decorations were rearranged according to my design choices. Social invitations, once issued and managed by her, now passed through my oversight. Each small change reinforced the reality. Control was no longer hers to wield, and influence had a new name. Observers might have mistaken the calm execution for kindness or cooperation, but beneath the surface, it was a deliberate, strategic assertion of dominance. Even my husband, long a silent witness to my patience and strategic genius, marveled at the elegance of the transformation. He had seen the preparation, the careful legal maneuvering, and the patience required to act at precisely the right moment. The combination of timing, foresight, and intelligence had turned what might have been a simple act of revenge into a sweeping realignment of authority. Together, we navigated the household like orchestrators of a delicate performance, ensuring that every interaction reinforced the hierarchy that I had quietly established. My mother-in-law's attempts to maintain dignity became almost performative. She tried to smile, to engage in casual conversation, to reassert relevance, but every move was met with subtle reminders of reality. The house, the social space, and the emotional dynamics had shifted irreversibly. Where she had once controlled the atmosphere, now she moved within boundaries defined by the queen who had been underestimated for far too long. Every interaction was a lesson in humility, patience, and the quiet assertion of power. The social consequences extended beyond the immediate household. Neighbors, friends, and extended family had begun to notice the change. Subtle comments, admiring glances, and whispered acknowledgments confirmed that the queen's authority was recognized outside the walls of the home. The Christmas revelation had not merely transferred ownership of property. It had shifted perception, realigned respect, and redefined social standing. The quiet, strategic rise of a woman who had been treated as invisible now resonated in ways that could not be ignored. By the end of the week, my mother-in-law's behavior had fully transformed. She no longer attempted to assert dominance or challenge decisions. She moved cautiously, aware of the boundaries established by my authority. Pride remained, but it was tempered by acknowledgement. The family had absorbed the lesson. True power is not claimed by volume, by authority inherited, or by assumption. It is executed with strategy, patience, and precision. I had transformed years of underestimation into a triumph that left no room for contestation. Even the smallest details reflected the new order. Household routines, once dictated by my mother-in-law's meticulous planning, now adhered to my guidance. Tasks were assigned, social events coordinated, and family traditions adjusted under my subtle orchestration. Each shift reinforced the permanent reallocation of power. The documents that had sparked the transformation remained visible, silent symbols of my strategic brilliance, and constant reminders that authority, once earned and claimed, cannot easily be unseated. The ultimate satisfaction of this victory lay not in confrontation, but in observation. I watched as the family recalibrated their behaviors, realigned their assumptions, and learned to navigate a reality where the queen was no longer invisible. My mother-in-law, once the architect of control, became an unwitting student of humility, forced to acknowledge the brilliance, patience, and strategy that had brought this new order to life. Every glance, every gesture, every interaction reinforced the permanent lesson. Underestimate a woman, dismiss her, and she might quietly rise to claim what is rightfully hers. The emotional consequences were equally profound. My mother-in-law's pride, her social influence, and her sense of control had all been subtly dismantled. She was forced to navigate interactions with care, to consider her words, and to recognize the authority that had quietly, elegantly, and irrevocably replaced her dominance. Meanwhile, the rest of the family adjusted to a new rhythm, one defined not by inherited authority or assumptions, but by the undeniable presence of a queen who had transformed insult into power. By the end of the month, the Richardson household had fully adjusted to its new hierarchy. The queen's presence was acknowledged in every interaction, every decision, and every subtle movement. The mother-in-law's attempts at influence had been neutralized, her pride tempered by recognition. The family had absorbed the ultimate lesson. Authority is earned through strategy, patience, and execution, not assumed through birthright or condescension. I moved through the house one evening, observing the subtle shifts that confirmed my complete triumph. Every interaction, every adjustment, every acknowledgement of my presence reinforced the reality. The queen had risen, the crown had been claimed, and the family would never revert to the dynamics of the past. The Christmas insult, once wrapped in paper and smiles, had been transformed into a masterclass of strategy, patience, and undeniable authority. As I looked around the living room at the twinkling lights, the carefully arranged decorations, and the quiet acknowledgement of power, I realized that this victory was more than property or status. It was a demonstration of resilience, intelligence, and the art of turning invisibility into authority. The queen had risen, and the Richardson household would never forget the lessons learned that holiday season. This was the ultimate triumph, quiet, strategic, and undeniable. Every insult, every chore, every assumption had been transformed into leverage. The queen had claimed her crown, and the ripple of her rise had become an unshakable wave of authority, respect, and admiration.